The musket ball whistled past General George Washington's ear so close he could feel its heat against his weathered cheek. It was January 3rd, 1777, and the fate of the American Revolution hung by a thread thinner than the ice forming on the Delaware River behind them. While history would remember the Christmas crossing and the surprise at Trenton 9 days earlier, it was this frigid morning at Princeton that would truly determine whether the rebellion would survive or crumble into the footnotes of failed insurrections. Washington's breath formed crystalline clouds in the bitter air as he surveyed the battlefield through his spyglass. The British regulars of the 40th Foot Regiment were advancing in perfect formation across the frost-covered fields, their scarlet uniforms a stark contrast against the white landscape. Behind them, more redcoats emerged from the morning mistellements. Of the 55th Regiment and the mounted dragoons that had been pursuing the Continental Army since their audacious strike at Trenton, Captain Alexander Hamilton, barely 22, but already proving his worth as Washington's aide-de-camp, rode up with urgent intelligence. "Sir, our scouts report at least 800 British regulars advancing from the south. With more cavalry approaching from the east, Colonel Hand's riflemen are engaged, but they're vastly outnumbered." The young nation's commander-in-chief felt the weight of 18,000 Continental soldiers' lives pressing upon his shoulders. These weren't the fresh-faced volunteers who had answered the call to arms in 1770. These were the survivors' men who had endured the disasters at Long Island and Manhattan, who had retreated across New Jersey in tatters, who had crossed an ice-choked river on Christmas night because they believed in something greater than themselves, but belief alone wouldn't stop British steel. Washington's horse stamped nervously as artillery began to boom in the distance. The sound rolled across the frozen New Jersey countryside like thunder, announcing that Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mohood's forces had engaged the American advance guard. Somewhere in those woods beyond Princeton, brave men were dying for, cause that many European observers already considered lost. The general closed his spyglass with a decisive snap. Trenton had been a morale victory. Certainly a Christmas miracle that had kept the army together and convinced some soldiers to extend their enlistments, but Princeton would be different. Here, they wouldn't be catching sleeping Hessians off guard. Here, they would face veteran British regulars in open battle. And the outcome would echo across the Atlantic to the courts of Europe, where potential allies watched and waited to see if this colonial rebellion had any chance of success. As Washington spurred his mount toward the sound of the guns, he carried with him not just the hopes of his ragged army, but the dreams of a nation that existed only in the hearts of patriots willing to die for it. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across a landscape that would soon be stained with blood and forever changed by the choices made in the next few hours. Behind him, the Continental Army began its advance toward Princeton there, footsteps crunching in the snow as they marched toward a destiny none of them could yet imagine. The morning of January 3rd found Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mohood in an unusually contemplative mood as he prepared his British forces for what he assumed would be a routine march to reinforce Trenton. The veteran officer, commanding the 17th, 40th, and 55th Regiments afoot, had received urgent orders from General Charles Cornwallis to abandon Princeton and consolidate British strength against Washington's presumptuous rebels. Mohood had no way of knowing that at that very moment, Washington was executing one of the most audacious tactical maneuvers of the entire war. While Cornwallis had massed nearly 8,000 troops at Trenton, convinced he had trapped the Continental Army against the Delaware River, Washington had slipped away in the darkness, using back roads that only local guides knew. The American commander was leading his entire force in a wide, flanking movement toward Princeton Gamble that would either crush British communications in New Jersey or result in the complete destruction of his army. According to military historian David Hackett Fisher's acclaimed work Washington's Crossing, this maneuver represented Washington's evolution from a cautious Virginia planter into a revolutionary strategist willing to risk everything on a single, decisive stroke. The two armies approached each other through the morning, mist like chess pieces, moving toward an inevitable collision. Captain Thomas Rodney of the Delaware Militia later wrote in his journal about the surreal quality of that march, how the frozen ground rang beneath thousands of feet, how the men's breath created clouds that hung in the still air like the ghosts of battles yet to come. Washington had divided his force into two main columns. General Hugh Mercer, the Scottish physician turned warrior, led 2,000 men along the Quaker Road toward Princeton, while General John Sullivan commanded a larger force that would sweep around to attack the town directly. It was a complex maneuver that required precise timing and no small amount of luck. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light through the bare branches of the New Jersey woodlands, both commanders remained unaware of each other's proximity. Mulhood's scouts had reported no significant American activity, while Washington's intelligence suggested that Princeton was lightly defended. Both assumptions were about to prove catastrophically wrong. The first hint of impending collision came when Mulhood's advance guard spotted movement in the woods near the Quaker meeting house. What they initially took for local militia soon revealed itself as something far more substantial. Through the trees, glimpses of blue uniforms and the glint of bayonets suggested a significant force moving with military precision. At almost the same moment, General Mercer's scouts emerged from a copse of trees to find themselves face-to-face with British pickets. The two patrols stared at each other across a frozen field for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then someone history has never recorded who raised his musket and fired. That single shot, echoing across the New Jersey countryside, like a thunderclap, announced the beginning of a battle that would reshape the American Revolution. Within minutes, both armies were deploying from march column into battle formation, officers shouting orders, drums beating the advance, and soldiers checking their flints and priming powder. Washington, riding with Sullivan's column, heard the distant musketry and immediately grasped the situation. His carefully planned surprise attack had become a meeting engagement, a collision of armies that would test every lesson he had learned in 2 years of desperate warfare. The fate of American independence would be decided not by stealth and surprise, but by the courage of men willing to stand and fight in the face of professional soldiers who had conquered half the world. The crash of musketry erupted like a deadly symphony across the frost-covered fields of Princeton as General Hugh Mercer's advance guard collided with Lieutenant Colonel Mulhood's British regulars. The Philadelphia physician turned continental. General spurred his horse forward, his sword gleaming in the pale January sunlight as he attempted to rally his men against the disciplined volleys of the 17th Foot. Captain William Washington, the general's young cousin, watched in horror as the British line advanced with mechanical precision. These weren't the confused Hessians they had surprised at Trenton. These were veteran regulars who had served in the Caribbean, men who loaded and fired with a cadence that spoke of years drilling on parade grounds from Halifax. Mercer's Continentals, many of them raw recruits from Pennsylvania and Delaware, wavered under the withering fire. The British had seized a small orchard on rising ground, using the trees as cover, while their Brown Bess muskets sent lead balls whistling through the American ranks. Men fell screaming, their blood steaming in the cold air, while others broke and began streaming toward the rear. "Hold fast, men," Mercer shouted, his Scottish accent thick with emotion. "Stand your ground." But discipline, not courage, was winning this fight. The British advanced with bayonets fixed, their steel points catching the morning light like deadly stars. American militiamen, many armed only with hunting rifles, had no answer to cold steel. The bayonet charge was a terror that no amount of marksmanship could overcome. Mercer himself fell wounded, struck down by bayonet thrusts as he tried to prevent his line from collapsing entirely. The sight of their beloved general falling sent shock waves through the American ranks. What had begun as an orderly advance was rapidly becoming a rout. From his position with the main column, Washington heard the intensity of the firing increase dramatically. The sound of battle, that unmistakable mixture of musketry, shouting, and the screams of wounded men carried clearly through the cold air. He knew immediately that Mercer was in serious trouble. Captain Hamilton rode up with a face pale as the winter sky. "Sir, the advance guard is falling back. General Mercer is down, and the British have seized the orchard." If they hold that position, they'll command the entire battlefield. Washington's jaw tightened. The careful plan was unraveling, but this was precisely the moment that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. Instead of retreating or attempting to salvage what he could, Washington made a decision that would be remembered for centuries. "Order Sullivan to accelerate his advance on the town," he commanded. "We'll hit them from 2 directions simultaneously. And signal Captain Hamilton's battery to unlimber immediately." The young Alexander Hamilton, despite sharing a name with Washington's aide-de-camp, was actually commanding a New York artillery company. His guns were among the few pieces that had survived the retreat across New Jersey, and Washington was about to stake everything on their effectiveness. As American artillery began to deploy, British reinforcements appeared on the battlefield. The 40th Foot emerged from Princeton itself, their officers shouting orders as they formed a line of battle. What had begun as a meeting engagement was escalating into a general action that would involve thousands of men on both sides. The tide of battle hung in perfect balance. On one side stood the might of the British Empire professional soldiers backed by the world's most powerful navy, fighting to preserve the largest empire in human history. On the other stood farmers and merchants, mechanics and lawyers, united by an idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. As Washington rode toward the sound of the guns, he carried with him not just his sword and pistols, but the future of human liberty. The next hour would determine whether that future would be stillborn on the frozen fields of New Jersey. George Washington had faced many moments of crisis during his military career, but nothing compared to the scene that greeted him as he crested the ridge overlooking the Princeton battlefield. Below him, the remnants of Mercer's command were streaming backward in disorder, while British regulars occupied the high ground around William Clark's Orchard. The scarlet-coated soldiers were already reforming their lines, preparing to sweep the field clear of American resistance. Captain Joseph Mulder, commanding a Pennsylvania artillery battery, was desperately trying to unlimber his guns under heavy musket fire. British sharpshooters had already picked off several of his gunners, and the remaining men worked with the knowledge that a bayonet charge could overwhelm their position at any moment. "Captain Mulder," Washington called out as he rode into the chaos. "Get those guns into action immediately. Aim for the orchard." The sight of their commander-in-chief riding calmly through the storm of bullets had an electrifying effect on the retreating Americans. Men who moments before had been running for their lives suddenly stopped, turned, and began looking for their officers. Sergeants started shouting orders, and the rabble began to coalesce back into military formations. Washington positioned himself between his retreating troops and the advancing British, a move so audacious that even veteran soldiers stared in amazement. Here was a general who shared their dangers, who risked his life alongside the common soldiers he commanded. It was a type of leadership that the class-conscious British Army rarely produced. Captain Alexander Hamilton. The aide-de-camp rode up with desperate urgency in his voice. "Sir, you must withdraw to a safer position. If you're killed or captured, the army will disintegrate." But Washington ignored the plea. He had learned something crucial about leadership during the dark days of retreat across New Jersey. Soldiers would follow orders from a safe distance, but they would die for a commander who shared their risks. At this critical moment, his personal example was worth more than tactical brilliance. The British advance faltered as American artillery found its range. Captain Mulder's guns, served by men who knew their lives depended on accuracy, began tearing gaps in the redcoat lines. But Mahood was a professional soldier who understood that infantry could not stand indefinitely under artillery fire. He ordered his men to fix bayonets and prepare for a general assault. According to historian William Stryker's definitive account, the battles of Trenton and Princeton, it was at this moment that Washington made perhaps the most crucial decision of his military career. Rather than attempting to conduct an orderly withdrawal, he chose to counterattack. "Form line," Washington shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield with remarkable clarity. "We advance." It was madness by conventional military standards. Washington was ordering troops who had been in retreat to attack veteran British regulars, who occupied superior ground. But conventional military standards had not won the battles of Lexington and Concord, had not sustained the army through the disasters of Long Island and Manhattan, had not carried men across an ice-choked river on Christmas night. Captain William Washington, commanding a troop of Continental Light Dragoons, watched his famous cousin with something approaching. Here was leadership stripped to its essence, not the complex theories taught in European military academies, but the simple courage of a man willing to stake everything on his ability to inspire others. The American line began to advance. Step by step across the frozen ground. These weren't the perfectly drilled soldiers of European armies, but they were men fighting for their homes, their families, and an idea that burned in their hearts like sacred fire. As they marched forward into the teeth of British resistance, they carried with them the hopes of every colonist who dreamed of freedom, the outcome of the battle, and perhaps the entire revolution would be decided in the next few minutes. Moment of truth arrived with the thunderous crash of opposing volleys echoing across the Princeton battlefield. British muskets erupted in disciplined sequence, teased their brown-best firearms sending a wall of lead toward the advancing American line. But something had changed in the Continental Army since their desperate retreat across New Jersey. These men, tested by hardship and inspired by their commander's personal courage, did not break. Captain Thomas Rodney of the Delaware Militia later described the scene in his journal. The way American soldiers closed ranks as comrades fell. The grim determination on faces blackened by gunpowder. The steady advance across ground littered with the debris of battle. This was no longer the amateur army that had fled from Long Island. This was a force forged by adversity into something approaching professional competence. Lieutenant Colonel Mulhood watched the American advance with growing concern. His tactical position remained strong. His men occupied high ground and had the advantage of superior training. But the enemy approaching his lines displayed a steadiness that he had not expected from colonial troops. These Americans were not charging wildly or breaking at the first volley. They were advancing with the methodical precision of veteran soldiers. Washington rode along his line, completely exposed to enemy fire, his presence galvanizing every man who saw him. Captain Hamilton's artillery battery had found its rhythm, sending solid shot crashing through the British ranks with devastating effect. The combination of steady infantry advance and accurate artillery fire was beginning to tell. "Sir?" Captain Hamilton called out to Washington, his young voice barely audible above the roar of battle. "Sullivan's column is engaging the town. British are being pressed from two directions." Indeed, General John Sullivan's flanking movement had finally reached Princeton itself. The sound of musketry from the town streets indicated that American forces were engaging whatever British troops remained there. Mulhood suddenly found himself caught between two fires. His communication with Princeton severed, and his retreat potentially compromised. The British colonel made a command decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Rather than attempting to hold his position against mounting pressure, he ordered a fighting withdrawal toward the post road. It was a tactically sound move, but it conceded the psychological initiative to the Americans at the crucial moment. As historical accounts from the New York Historical Society document, the sight of British regulars falling back had an electrifying effect on the Continental Army. Men who had spent months retreating, who had endured the humiliation of repeated defeats, suddenly found themselves advancing against the professional soldiers of the world's greatest military power. Captain William Washington seized the moment. Leading his dragoons in a sweeping charge, he struck the British flank just as Mulhood's men were attempting to disengage. The surprise cavalry attack, hitting troops already unsettled by the general American advance, shattered the cohesion of the 17th Foot. Individual British soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in the Caribbean and Canada, found themselves scattered across the frozen New Jersey countryside. Some attempted to rally around their officers, while others began a headlong retreat toward New Brunswick. The disciplined British formation that had dominated the early fighting was dissolving into chaos. Washington, pressed his advantage with the instincts of a born battlefield commander. "Pursue them," he ordered. "Give them no time to reform." The American advance became a general pursuit. Continental soldiers, militia units, and artillery all pressed forward in a coordinated effort that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. The army that crossed the Delaware on Christmas night had been a desperate collection of amateur soldiers. The force pursuing British regulars across the Princeton battlefield was beginning to resemble a professional military organization, but the battle was not yet over. British reinforcements were still arriving from Princeton and Cornwallis's Maine. Army at Trenton would soon discover Washington's deception. The Americans had won a tactical victory, but strategic challenges remained. The pursuit of Mawhood's shattered forces carried across 2 miles of frozen New Jersey countryside. But Washington knew that tactical success meant nothing without strategic follow-through. As American soldiers rounded up British prisoners and gathered abandoned equipment, the commander-in-chief was already calculating the larger implications of his victory. Cornwallis would discover the ruse within hours. 8,000 British regulars would come streaming north from Trenton with murder in their hearts. "Captain." Alexander Hamilton rode up with a captured British standard, his face flushed with the excitement of victory. "Sir, the town is secured. General Sullivan reports minimal resistance, and we've taken nearly 200 prisoners." But Washington's expression remained grim despite the triumph. He had learned not to celebrate until his army was safely beyond enemy retaliation. "What of our casualties?" he asked quietly. The butcher's bill, as soldiers called it, was surprisingly light considering the intensity of the fighting. The Continental Army had lost perhaps 40 men killed and wounded, while British casualties approached 100. More importantly, the Americans had captured critical supplies, ammunition, artillery pieces that the struggling Continental Army desperately needed. Yet the greatest victory was not measured in materiel or casualties, but in morale. For the first time since the disasters of Long Island and Manhattan, the Continental Army had met British regulars in open battle and driven them from the field. The psychological transformation was visible on every soldier's face. These men now knew they could fight and win against the world's finest military force. General Hugh Mercer, grievously wounded in the initial fighting, was carried to a nearby farmhouse where Continental surgeons worked desperately to save his life. The beloved Scottish physician had suffered multiple bayonet wounds while trying to rally his troops, and his condition remained critical. Washington visited him briefly, gripping the wounded general's hand while promising that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. As American forces consolidated their hold on Princeton, it's disturbing intelligence arrived from the south. Cornwallis had discovered Washington's deception and was marching north with his entire force. British advance guards were already crossing Assunpink Creek, and the main army would reach Princeton within hours. Washington faced another crucial decision. He could attempt to hold Princeton and fight Cornwallis's superior force, risking the destruction of his army in a defensive battle, or he could continue his strategic withdrawal, preserving his forces while yielding the tactical gains of the morning's victory. The choice revealed Washington's growing strategic sophistication. Rather than attempting to hold ground that he could not realistically defend, he ordered an immediate withdrawal toward Morristown. The Continental Army would take its prisoners, its captured supplies, and most importantly, its enhanced reputation, into the security of the New Jersey highlands. According to military records preserved in the Library of Congress, the American withdrawal from Princeton demonstrated the same tactical competence that had characterized the morning's battle. Rear guards covered the retreat, wounded were evacuated efficiently, and captured material was secured despite the approaching British threat. The transformation was remarkable. 6 months earlier, Washington's army had fled from New York in complete disorder, abandoning equipment and leaving wounded behind. Now they conducted a tactical withdrawal that any European army would have admired, moving with purpose and discipline despite enemy pressure. As the last American soldiers disappeared into the New Jersey countryside, British advance units finally reached Princeton. They found empty streets, abandoned British equipment, and clear evidence that their colonial enemies had evolved into something far more dangerous than amateur rebels. The Continental Army was becoming a professional military force capable of striking anywhere, anytime. The implications would resonate far beyond the frozen fields of New Jersey. In the coffee houses of London, the salons of Paris, and the courts of European capitals, observers began to reassess their assumptions about the American rebellion. What had seemed like a hopeless colonial uprising was beginning to resemble a legitimate war of independence. The news of Princeton spread across the 13 colonies like wildfire, carried by express riders who understood they were delivering more than battlefield intelligence. They were carrying hope itself. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress who had fled to Baltimore in panic just weeks earlier began to reconsider their hasty departure. In New York, British commanders found themselves facing a strategic situation that had changed fundamentally overnight. General William Howe, commanding British forces in North America, received Mawhood's dispatch in his New York headquarters with growing alarm. The report spoke not just of tactical defeat, but of an enemy army that had demonstrated capabilities far beyond anything previously imagined. The ragged colonials who had fled across New Jersey in November had somehow transformed themselves into a force capable of complex maneuvers and sustained combat against veteran regulars. In London, Lord George Germain, Secretary of State for the Colonies, would soon face uncomfortable questions in Parliament about how a rabble of colonial farmers had outmaneuvered professional British commanders. The easy confidence that had characterized British planning was evaporating in the cold light of American tactical competence. But the most profound changes were occurring within the Continental Army itself. Soldiers who had crossed the Delaware on Christmas night as desperate men clinging to a fading cause now marched toward Morristown as victorious warriors who had proven themselves against the world's finest military force. The transformation was visible in their bearing, audible in their conversations, manifest in their willingness to extend enlistments that would have expired within days. Captain Thomas Rodney captured the mood in his journal. Our men are no longer the same. As before, they have tasted victory and found it sweet. They know now that British steel is not invincible, that redcoat discipline can be matched by American determination. Washington established his winter headquarters at Morristown with a strategic situation dramatically improved from just 10 days earlier. The twin victories at Trenton and Princeton had not only saved the Continental Army from dissolution, but had fundamentally altered the character of the conflict. European observers who had written off the American rebellion were now forced to acknowledge that they were witnessing a legitimate war of independence. General Hugh Mercer died of his wounds on January 12, 1777, becoming one of the first senior Continental officers to give his life in successful battle rather than desperate retreat. His sacrifice symbolized the price of transformation. The Continental Army's evolution from amateur militia to professional force had been paid for in the blood of patriots who believed that liberty was worth dying for. The strategic implications of Princeton extended far beyond American borders. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin found French officials suddenly more receptive to discussions about potential alliance. The American envoy could now point to concrete military successes, not just noble sentiments about natural rights. The victory had provided tangible evidence that the colonists might actually win their independence. King Louis XVI's ministers began serious consideration of what had previously been dismissed as a quixotic adventure. French military advisors analyzed the Princeton campaign and found tactical sophistication that suggested the Americans might indeed be capable of sustaining a prolonged war against British power. As winter deepened around Morristown, Washington used the respite to rebuild and reorganize his forces. The army that emerged from the New Jersey highlands in the spring of 1777 would bear little resemblance to the desperate band that had crossed the Delaware on Christmas night. Princeton had not just been a battle, it had been a metamorphosis. The revolution would continue for 6 more years. Through victories and defeats, advances and retreats, moments of triumph and periods of despair. But historians would mark the morning of January 3, 1770 as the moment when the Continental Army stopped running and started fighting. Everyone talks about Trenton. But Princeton was the real game changer. The battle that transformed a colonial rebellion into a war for independence that would reshape the world in the frozen fields where American and British soldiers had fought. With such desperate courage, spring would eventually return, bringing new grass to cover the bloodstains and wildflowers to mark the graves of men who died for an idea. But the echoes of that morning's gunfire would resonate through the centuries, reminding future generations that liberty, once won, must always be defended by those brave enough to stand and fight for it.